Did Keir Starmer just try to silence Britain's farmers and get thoroughly humiliated in the process? One moment the Labour leader was preaching about green justice from his polished podiums, and the next, Britain watched as the countryside erupted in fury. Tractors blockaded cities, and a silent judiciary delivered a thunderous warning: back off, or risk collapse. Starmer, it seems, believed he could rewrite the rules of protest, property, and power. But then something entirely unexpected happened. Nigel Farage stepped in and halted the arrests cold. Even King Charles is said to be furious. Keir Starmer didn't just miscalculate, he detonated a political firestorm. Did you know that over 95% of our viewers aren't subscribed to the channel? We totally get it, life gets busy, and sometimes it's easy to forget. But here's the thing, subscribing is completely free, and it really helps us keep creating the content you enjoy. So, why not hit that subscribe button and join our community? It only takes a second, but it makes a world of difference to us. Thank you for your support. The inheritance tax proposal, from policy to peril. It all began like any other quiet policy rollout, buried in legal jargon and dressed up in the language of fairness and climate responsibility. Labour's new inheritance tax proposal initially appeared harmless to the city elite, a 20% levy on farmland valued over £1 million. On paper, it seemed a minor adjustment. However, outside Westminster's bubble, in the barns, in the fields, and on the muddy boots of the very people who feed this country, it wasn't seen as a tax, it was a threat. For Britain's farming families, that land isn't just acreage, it's a legacy, a bloodline, passed from grandfathers to sons, from mothers to daughters. It's their home, their livelihood, their history, all intertwined. And now, Labour wanted a cut, a significant one. Suddenly, if a farmer died, their children wouldn't inherit a way of life, they'd inherit a crippling debt, forced to sell the land or lose everything. Starmer and his inner circle might have labelled it policy, the countryside called it theft. From whispers to warnings, the countryside rises up. But it didn't stop at the tax. As word spread, the countryside stirred. What began as whispers escalated into meetings, quiet frustration transformed into public fury. And then, the tractors rolled in. Parliament Square, Labour HQ, and major highways across the Midlands and the South were blockaded. Fields lay abandoned as farmers took to the roads, not with weapons, but with banners and their harvest, dumped defiantly in front of Labour offices. Signs read, "No farmers, no food. You tax our land, you starve your nation." Starmer, it seems, panicked. Instead of listening, he cracked down. Instead of negotiating, he called in the police. Instead of dialogue, he reached for control. Peaceful farmers were suddenly branded agitators. Rural leaders found themselves under surveillance. Police began collecting names, tapping phones, and preparing charges. Behind closed doors, Labour officials whispered about strategic arrests. Protest organisers, some in their 60s, were warned, step back or be dragged out. Starmer didn't just lose the countryside, he declared war on it. Farage intervenes as judiciary revolts. That's when the judiciary stirred, and the resistance gained a prominent face. Amidst the chaos of the panic policing, someone stepped forward, not from Labour, nor from the Tories, but from the outside, from the populist fringe Labour despises and fears, Nigel Farage. Nigel Farage didn't just walk into this fight, he stormed in. While Starmer's team scrambled to control the fallout, to spin the narrative, and to label protesting farmers as disruptive elements, Farage took to the airwaves and tore the curtain down. He didn't mince words, he didn't hesitate. On GB News, at Reform UK rallies, and across every platform that would have him, he exposed the entire operation for what it was, a government crackdown on dissent disguised as climate policy. This is a war on the countryside, he declared, economic cleansing, a state-led purge of the very people who feed us. And the country listened. Because while Labour was trying to criminalise tractors and rebrand farmers as extremists, Farage was calling it what every honest Brit could see. It was theft, it was suppression, and it was the raw machinery of power spinning out of control. A silent revolt, the judiciary pushes back. And that's when something extraordinary happened, something Labour never saw coming. The resistance jumped the fence from protest to power. While Farage was lighting fires in public, behind closed doors, a different kind of rebellion was brewing, one that shook the very foundations of Labour's control. Within the judiciary, a silent but seismic revolt began. Leaks started dripping from high-level legal offices. Insiders revealed that senior judges were horrified by what was unfolding. One particularly damning leak exposed a warning from a top legal figure, anonymous for now but deeply connected. His message to Labour was blunt: What you're planning is unconstitutional, unlawful, and dangerous. Arresting farmers for protesting taxes, monitoring their phones, tracking their movements, preparing to detain organizers preemptively, that's not law, that's tyranny. The phrase that echoed from that leaked memo hit like a thunderclap: gross abuse of power. That wasn't the opposition speaking, that was the judiciary. The very institution tasked with protecting the law was now turning against the people who claimed to write it. Labour had gone too far. And now, the checks and balances that Starmer hoped would stay silent were finally snapping into place. But Starmer, cornered and rattled, kept pushing. He doubled down on his message: climate justice, long-term responsibility, rebalancing the system. But it was too late. His words didn't match his actions. While he spoke of fairness, farmers were being detained. While he preached compassion, elderly landowners were being interrogated. While Keir Starmer bragged about clean energy and carbon targets, footage leaked of riot vans rolling into rural communities. When reporters pushed for answers, Labour's response was cold and dismissive: we are protecting the public. Yet the public didn't need protecting from farmers, they needed protecting from the government itself. And here's where Farage executed a move that truly changed the tide. He didn't merely criticise, he mobilised. Reform UK began dispatching legal observers to protests, launching a hotline for farmers facing police pressure, and meticulously publishing every leaked memo, every judicial warning, and every internal Labour message that exposed the true state of affairs. Suddenly, what Starmer had envisioned as a quiet suppression operation erupted into a full-blown political earthquake. The widening divide, Labour's image crumbles. Journalists who had previously overlooked rural issues began digging. Civil liberties groups raised red flags. Even some of Labour's allies in the media started to question the prevailing narrative. Within the party itself, a cold wind began to blow. Rural Labour MPs, though few in number, started to murmur their disquiet. Backbenchers sent private messages to journalists, expressing concern. Some even quietly reached out to Reform UK figures for off-the-record conversations. The cracks widened because the truth was undeniable: Labour had crossed a line. And once that line was crossed, once the party traditionally associated with workers and fairness had turned on the very people who grow the food, till the soil, and preserve the land, there was no turning back. Starmer's carefully constructed image, built over years, began to crumble. His polished speeches, his lawyerly precision, his crafted moderation, all fell flat under the weight of rubber tires, protest signs, and legal indictments. The mask didn't just slip, it shattered, revealing the face beneath. Not a calm reformer, not a moderate, but a panicked technocrat, desperate to maintain control over a nation that was slipping from his grasp. A national uprising, the countryside roars. And Farage, he didn't just join the fight, he took it over. The countryside didn't calm down, it rose. By the third week of protests, it was no longer just a handful of tractors circling Parliament. It was a national uprising. Road after road, town after town, blocked, jammed, gridlocked. Farmers arrived not just from Kent and Norfolk, but from Wales, from Scotland, from the north. Some drove 10 hours overnight just to make their voices heard. Villages stood still as farmers abandoned their work to join the front lines. Fields went untended, livestock were left to roam because something far bigger than crops and cattle was unfolding. This was no longer about tax, it was about survival, about dignity, about refusing to be treated like criminals by the very people who claimed to represent them. And this time, the country listened. Not just the countryside, but the nation as a whole. Videos of elderly farmers being dragged from protests went viral. Footage of Labour staffers sneering at rural reactionaries made its way to the headlines. And when it emerged that internal Labour memos had described farmers as security risks and uncooperative assets, the backlash erupted. Phone lines to Reform UK were inundated. Local councils across the South and Midlands began facing protests of their own. The hammer blow, Labour's own legal counsel leaked. Then came the real blow. Labour's rural councillors began resigning, quietly at first, then publicly, with lengthy statements denouncing the party's betrayal. Some switched to independent status, a few defected outright to Reform UK. Starmer attempted to get ahead of it, holding press conferences, issuing scripted appeals, and deploying soft language about dialogue and mutual respect. But it didn't work, because the images told a different story: farmers being kettled by police, protesters being photographed without warrants, legal observers being blocked from protest zones. It was no longer a dispute, it was a siege. And every time Labour attempted to de-escalate with words, the machinery of state repression proved them liars. Meanwhile, Nigel Farage was ubiquitous. At a protest outside Leeds, standing atop a hay bale, megaphone in hand, he thundered, "You grow the food and they treat you like criminals. No more." On national radio, he grilled Labour spokespeople into silence. On GB News, night after night, he exposed every new detail: the surveillance operations, the internal communications, the gag orders placed on dissenting police officers. He wasn't just outraged, he was armed with receipts, and the public took notice. Polls began to shift, not just in favourability, but in momentum. Reform UK, once dismissed as merely a protest vote, surged among rural voters, small business owners, and even disillusioned Labour moderates who had finally had enough. And then came the hammer blow. Labour's own internal, private, secret legal counsel was leaked, a document prepared for Starmer's cabinet. It meticulously laid out the legal risks of continued arrests, detailed potential breaches of human rights law, and warned of serious consequences if Labour were found to be targeting protesters based on political ideology. The phrase used in the leaked document was chilling, revealing a pattern of authoritarian behaviour inconsistent with democratic standards. This document should have stayed buried, but Farage got hold of it and read it live on air. The silence from Labour was deafening. Just like that, the protests transformed. They became a movement, no longer solely about land, tax, or farming. It evolved into a cry against top-down control, against technocratic arrogance, and against a party that once championed workers but now surveilled them, arrested them, and branded them as threats. Town halls began holding emergency meetings. Villages passed symbolic motions, declaring no confidence in Labour governance. A group of young farmers launched a grassroots digital campaign titled, "We Are Not Your Subjects," which exploded, garnering millions of views in days and flooding social media with defiance, solidarity, and raw rural anger. Meanwhile, Labour HQ resembled a bunker under siege. Officials leaked that Starmer was furious, isolated, and losing the room. Senior staffers reportedly advised him to walk back the tax. Others pushed for even harder crackdowns, resulting in paralysis. Starmer was trapped by his own policies, his own image, and a revolt he could neither crush nor calm. Farage's vision, from critic to commander. In that vacuum of leadership, Farage stepped in fully, not just as a critic, but as a commander. He didn't merely oppose Labour's plan, he laid out a clear vision: total repeal of the farmland inheritance tax, suspension of all climate-linked regulations until a national referendum could be held, and a new Rural Sovereignty Act protecting farmers' rights to land, protest, and property. He wasn't just feeding the fire, he was building a platform on it. This wasn't just about Labour anymore, it was about the soul of Britain. It was about who gets to decide what this country is, elitists with spreadsheets and carbon targets, or the people who dig, plant, harvest, and build. Farage made it clear Labour had chosen a side, and the people were choosing theirs. The shattering of Labour's image. It was supposed to be a quiet reform, a tax adjustment, a green initiative. That's how Starmer's advisors pitched it: a clean, progressive policy to help fund the future, raise revenue, and push Britain into a greener age. But it ended with riot vans, judicial revolts, mass resignations, media meltdowns, and a public awakening that shattered the image of Labour beyond recognition. And in the middle of it all, on the cracked roads between villages, in the fields now crowded with banners and cameras, in Parliament's shadow, and across every digital channel, stood Nigel Farage, holding the line while Labour watched its own narrative burn. As tractors continued to blockade key routes into London, the pressure on Starmer intensified from every direction. Police unions began expressing unease over the orders they were receiving. Officers on the ground leaked audio and bodycam footage showing they were being told to prioritise optics over fairness. In one clip, a supervisor was heard telling units to contain visible dissent, especially near media. The public backlash was immediate. It wasn't just that Labour was targeting peaceful protesters, it was that they were doing it knowingly, calculatingly, as a matter of political strategy, not safety, not law, but purely for image management and damage control. Internal chaos and a judge's warning. Inside the Labour Party, chaos spread like rot beneath a floorboard. Meetings devolved into shouting matches. Senior advisors clashed over whether to stand firm or issue a public apology. Some warned that backpedalling would look weak, others warned that not backpedalling would look tyrannical. Starmer, once the embodiment of focus and clarity, now appeared indecisive and rattled. He had built his leadership on the illusion of competence, of balance, of being the adult in the room after years of Tory chaos. But under pressure, that mask shattered. When Britain needed calm, he chose crackdowns. When people begged for dialogue, he chose surveillance. And when the nation's most honest workers, the farmers, stood up to defend their families, he called in the state to break them down. Leaked WhatsApp messages from Labour insiders revealed internal polling that was setting off alarms. Key rural constituencies were shifting overnight. Reform UK had jumped 10 points in key battlegrounds. Worse still, Labour was bleeding support not just to reform, but to no one. Disillusioned voters were walking away entirely. One strategist summed it up in a brutal sentence: "We've woken up the countryside, and they won't forget." And they didn't. While Starmer attempted to calm the storm with focus groups and lukewarm promises of reviewing the tax, Farage went straight to the people. He travelled county to county, holding town hall-style gatherings, not as a politician talking down to a crowd, but as one of them, listening, nodding, speaking plainly. "This is not just about farming," he repeated again and again. "This is about control. Who owns your land? Who decides your future? Who gets to tell you what's fair? And who gets silenced when they disagree?" It wasn't a campaign anymore. It was a revolt, a slow-moving avalanche, gathering voices and strength with every passing day. Just when it seemed Labour couldn't sink lower, another judge spoke out. This time, not through anonymous memos, but directly. A retired High Court justice penned an open letter, published by major newspapers, warning that the use of police resources against farmers constituted a dangerous erosion of civil liberties in service of ideological compliance. He compared Labour's tactics to soft authoritarianism masked by legal procedure. The public reaction was explosive. Suddenly, it wasn't just Reform UK or Farage making the accusations. It was the judiciary, the legal system, the very backbone of British democratic checks and balances, declaring that something had gone terribly wrong. And what was Starmer's response? A press conference, carefully staged, emotionally flat, scripted to death. In a tone utterly devoid of conviction, he reiterated Labour's respect for peaceful protest, while conspicuously refusing to address the arrests, the surveillance, the gag orders, or the broader crackdown. When pressed, he resorted to blaming operational decisions by local authorities. There was no accountability, no apology, no leadership, just deflection. But the country had already seen too much. More damning footage emerged: drone shots of police staging vans outside farms in Norfolk, voice recordings of local councillors receiving veiled warnings not to support protests, and emails showing Labour-linked NGOs planning media campaigns to label the protest movement as climate denialist extremism. The narrative collapsed completely. What was left was the stark truth: a party obsessed with control, utterly out of touch with the people it claimed to fight for, and terrified of any voice that dared speak against its carefully crafted agenda. Farage's escalation and the NFU's stance. Meanwhile, Farage didn't just maintain momentum, he escalated. He announced the formation of a rural Britain coalition, uniting farmers, small-town business owners, and disaffected local leaders under a shared banner of resistance. He launched a petition calling for a full public inquiry into Labour's use of state resources against protesters, which garnered over 1 million signatures in days. He demanded a live televised debate with Starmer, but Starmer declined. That moment spoke volumes to the country. One man was willing to defend his beliefs in front of the nation, the other hid behind press releases and party lines. Then came the final blow. The National Farmers Union, NFU, long considered a neutral body, released a devastating statement. In it, they condemned the tax, the arrests, and the surveillance. More significantly, they urged all farmers to vote their conscience. It was the closest the NFU had ever come to endorsing an opposition movement. When asked directly if they were referring to Farage Reform UK, the union's president simply replied, "We support those who support us." Labour's illusion shattered. From that point on, the tide became a flood. Labour's climate plan was unofficially put on hold. Senior MPs began distancing themselves from Starmer's inner circle. Internal calls for a leadership challenge surfaced in political circles. And all the while, Farage toured the country, not as a fringe figure, but as the voice of an awakened majority. He wasn't offering platitudes, he was offering battle lines. And Britain, worn out by spin, by surveillance, by top-down technocracy, was ready to fight back. Starmer didn't just mishandle a policy, he exposed his party's soul. What began as a tax turned into a revolt. What began as a protest turned into a national reckoning. And what began as a crackdown ended with the complete collapse of Labour's illusion, the illusion that they represent the working class, the illusion that they are the party of fairness and justice, the illusion that they are here to listen. Because when the tractors rolled in, when the countryside rose, when the people who feed this country said no more, Starmer answered with force, with silence, with fear. He thought he could control the story, but Farage rewrote it. This wasn't about one man, it wasn't about one party. It was about a line in the dirt, A line that generations of farmers refused to let be crossed, a line that Labour thought they could erase with a spreadsheet and a speech. But Britain saw through it. The people saw the mask slip. They saw the machinery of state power grind into motion, not against criminals, not against chaos, but against the quiet, proud, decent people who ask for nothing but to be left to live and work in peace. And in that moment, when power met defiance, something ancient awoke in Britain. Not party loyalty, not policy debate, but rebellion. Righteous, unstoppable rebellion. The same spirit that has lived in every protest, every pushback, every movement that refused to be crushed under the weight of government arrogance. So now the question isn't about tax brackets or emissions targets. It's about freedom. It's about truth. It's about whether Britain is ruled by distant technocrats or by the people who live on its land, who raise its livestock, who grow its food, and who refuse to be ruled by fear. Farage knew that, the farmers knew that. And now the whole country does too. And Starmer, he didn't just lose control.